was still there, but he was changed. Number one, he had on clothes, which was probably a relief to many, and he was in his right mind. But the neighbors are not pleased. Mark reports they become afraid and they ask Jesus to leave. Go figure. This is a strange and unusually detailed account for Mark's gospel, which is the first and the briefest of the 4 New Testament gospels. Whenever a story is this detailed, New Testament scholars tell us that those details really matter. They are not there by accident. Those scholars agree that there was a core incident in the ministry of Jesus, much like this. And it not only appears like this in Mark's gospel, but also in a different form in Matthew and Luke's gospels. But this story from Jesus' life, often when we read it with our modern mind, I think raises as many questions as it answers. Maybe even more, since we do have these modern minds. So we might ask ourselves, how are we to read this weird story? Now, we might view it as a rather traditional and straightforward exorcism performed by Jesus. Coming right after the story of Jesus' calming of the storm on the lake, the story serves Mark's desire to assert that Jesus' power is not alone over the physical world, the storm and the water and the skies, but also over the spirit world. Remembering that in Jesus' day, the world was a highly spirit-filled place. That was the nature of that culture. So Legion's life, distorted by negative spirits, was finally released and restored to wholeness, to rightness of mind. Jesus was not just powerfully good and compassionate. He uses that compassion, that goodness, to challenge what robs people of human life. Mark thereby asserts that Jesus had authority over the negative, destructive, even the demonic forces that were very real to people in his day. Another reading might focus on the misery of Legion's life and his scarred relationship with the village. It drives Legion to threaten and bully, to rant and rave. It drives the villagers to seek dominance over him, literally to chain him. His neighbors view him as a container of evil, if not evil itself. In fact, they view him so much that way that when he is restored to his right mind and reclothed in a right spirit, they are afraid. The event itself scares them so much that they cannot welcome his return to health and to the community. Why is that? Why does Mark tell the story that way? Why cannot they accept another experience of Legion? Is it because his healing has cost them something? Their cash crop of pork that they were raising for the Roman legions, certainly they weren't raising it for the Jewish community. Was that too much to ask of them? Were they willing for Legion to just continue to suffer, to be lost and miserable, to be afraid and wild, to cut himself in fits of self-hatred or purging just as long as their lives went undisturbed? And if that were not enough, they turn around and ask Jesus, the healer, the giver of that restoration, to leave their neighborhood. So what is that about? Were they afraid of him? Might it be that Jesus' liberating touch, his engagement of the powers that rob people of life, and his refusal to be controlled by the status quo are too threatening for them to handle? Did Legion's restoration to wholeness prove too costly to both their prejudices and their pocketbooks? But there is another very important reading that surfaces in this strange story. Why was the man named Legion, of all things? Legion. That is a Latin name. All of us learned it in world history in the 8th or 9th grade, I think. And it's a very specific one with only one meaning in the world of Jesus and of Mark. Legion was a division of what? Roman. I'm glad your world history serves you well. Legion is a division of 1,000 Roman soldiers. They were the troops that occupied all of Palestine in Jesus' day. They were the daily, powerful presence of the Roman Empire that ruled over the Jewish people with an iron fist. They were particularly cruel to the Jewish peasants. They were the same ones who carried out regular crucifixions against common criminals and political dissidents who dared oppose Roman rule. They were the ones who enforced the collection of those odious taxes, occupation taxes that had bankrupted so many of those Jewish peasant families. There was one time, even under Greek rule, where most Jewish peasants had a tiny piece of land which they could farm and have a subsistence living off of it. But the new Roman taxation system had caused that to disappear. In fact, some scholars believe that likely Mary and Joseph, the peasant parents of Jesus, had once had such land, but no longer had it because Rome had decimated that system and had bankrupted the peasant people. You know, when we pray the Lord's Prayer, the form that we pray is, forgive us our debts. And though there are many other translations that have been adopted, the one in the Greek writing of the New Testament is, forgive us our debts as we forgive those. Okay? So debt was a big reality, and it was not just a personal reality, it was a political reality that forced so many people off the land that had once guaranteed them a subsistence living. It bankrupted them. So Legion, while he may have reflected the insanity that people were used to thinking about, perhaps Mark is reflecting that insanity, that wildness, was created by the Roman military and political system that impoverished poor people and even destroyed life. Was he the end result? The threatening outcome of what happens when people live under oppression and occupation and subjugation and an evil political system? Was he the end result of all that? Was his disturbance symbolic of a collective anxiety among the Jewish people, of suffering caused by the cruel empire that was draining the lifeblood out of the Jewish people? Most especially, people who had once been simply poor were now desperate. So this story is of the rich getting richer on the backs of the poor is not a new story. Its reality has been part of political systems for years, for millennia. And Jesus' ministry, dare we forget this, took place in the midst of this demonic political reality. And he took it to task head on. Notice some other details about Mark's report. After the spirits have been cast out of the troubled man, the rest of Mark's telling is filled with military language and images. The word he uses for a herd of pigs is the Greek word for a band of military conscript. Jesus dismisses the spirit from Legion, a military command. The pigs charge into the lake, using another military metaphor for rushing into battle. It is also instructive to note that at the very time of Mark's writing, the area around Gerasa had been the site of a cruel Roman assault on the peasant population. Roman soldiers, those legions, had occupied the town and then burned it to the ground, and after they had carefully taken all of their possessions as plunder. So the area was in the possession of the powerful legions of Rome. This man's legions problem was Mark's code for possession by a foreign spirit or power. In light of this history, Mark's choice of this site as the place of confrontation with the powers of the empire takes on a specifically political meaning. So still, why would these villagers chafe at the ouster of such evil in their midst? Were they afraid of Roman retaliation? Perhaps they had good reason to be. Was it easier to let poor legions suffer than to destabilize their situation? Was this the source of their fear of begging Jesus to leave? Do anything, but do not upset the empire. Was it to their economic advantage to be in cahoots with that very same empire? For surely those Jewish swine herds were not raising pork for the local population. Those occupying legions were the customers of all their pork. It would feed the enforcers of Rome's power. Given the Roman Empire's unassailable military power, military liberation from Rome's control was not very likely. But Mark, in this story, was serving notice that Jesus' ministry was in the service of another empire. We might call it God's rule, God's domain, God's kingdom, and not Rome's. God's domain was about to dawn, and Jesus had and would challenge Rome's ungodly and violent use of power and conquest to destroy people. So centuries later, we may not know exactly all that happened when Jesus encountered this seriously disturbed fellow named Legion, but this we do know. Mark wrote the story near the beginning of his gospel to assert that Jesus tackled not only the forces of religion gone wrong, as he had in the first chapters of Mark when he entered the synagogue and upset it, but he also was here to tackle the destructive forces of political power gone wrong. Both these forces had come to institutionalize human alienation and suffering, and both were abusive. Both misused their power. Both were life-robbing, not life-giving. And both were under